In part 2 of this multi-part solar install series, I will cover installing the mini rail racking system using the existing roof fasteners and installing the solar panels. So here's the mounting bracket that I will be using. This is called a mini rail. This particular one is 13 inches long and it has 3 different fastener holes. And the distance from this hole to this hole is 9 inches, and to this hole is 12 inches. So it could fit a 9 or a 12-inch rib metal. And on the back side, it does have these rubber EPDM patches for a watertight seal where it makes contact with the roof. And I'll use one of these at the beginning of a string of solar panels, then also one at each intersection where 2 solar panels meet. And these will be in from the end a bit depending on where my purlins are on my roof. So this mounts to the roof, and then the solar panel will set on top of it, and I'll use a black end clamp that slides in the end of the mini rail, and then it'll clamp down onto the panel, fastening it to the mini rail. And this particular clamp is called a mid clamp. So this clamp also slides in the mini rail, and it clamps down where 2 panels intersect. Now if you notice, I went with the blacked out clamps and the panel frames, but Signature Solar did not have these mini rails in black. Each string of panels will have 2 mini rails sticking out at the beginning and the end, so I'm going to paint these black to help them blend in. 4 mini rails per string times 4 strings means I need to paint 16 mini rails black. First, I hit them with a coat of Rust-Oleum Professional Primer, then 2 coats of Rust-Oleum Flat Black High Performance Enamel. I need to measure my panels to figure out where my mini rails go on the roof. So these panels are 67 3/4 inches long and 44 5/8 wide. So the mid clamps that go in between the panels also act as a spacer, ensuring a consistent gap between each panel of about 7/8 inch. So the 44 5/8 plus 7/8 comes to 45.5 inches, which is the interval that my mini rails need to be set at. So my first interval is 45.5, and I'll add 45.5 to that, which comes to 91 inches for my second interval. To calculate the rest, I'll just keep hitting the equals button on the calculator. So the third interval is 136.5, the fourth is 182, the fifth is 227.5, the sixth is 273, the seventh is 318.5, the eighth is 364, and the ninth and final one is 409.5 inches. So unfortunately, I don't have a south-facing slope on my detached garage here. This slope faces the east and this slope faces the west. So I'm going to put 2 strings of 9 on the east slope, 2 strings of 9 on the west slope, and I'm going to see how that works out from a performance standpoint. So these solar panels are 67 3/4 long, and I'm going to keep them towards the peak of the roof. And I'll have my mini rails at the top row of screws. I'll skip that row, then I'll put another set of mini rails at 4 foot down from the top row of mini rails, and then my solar panels will be centered on that. And then for the bottom row of solar panels, I'll just go down 1 row, do a row of mini rails, skip a row, and then do my bottom row of mini rails 4 foot down as well. And then my bottom row of solar panels will be centered on that. So I want to leave a walkway at the end of my panels, so I'm going to come in about 3 foot, and I'll start my row of panels right here. Back this screw out, and I'll just hook my tape measure on this screw and go down through and then mark the intervals where my mini rails will be. So the first one's at 45.5, 91, 136.5, 182, 227.5, 273, 318.5, 364, and 409.5. So the first thing I actually did up here on this roof is I replaced the standard metal roofing screw with these upgraded ZXL screws. These screws have a warranty where these old screws do not, and they have the larger one-piece head which should help hold the mini rails on, and they use a 5/16 nut driver versus standard screw which uses a 1/4 inch nut driver. I bought these at my local metal roofing supplier. They're basically an upgraded fastener option for standard roofing panels. Alright, so here's my line where the panels will intersect. So one end of the mini rail actually hangs past, which is nice if let's say the panels would intersect right here, you'd have this extra for fastening the panels to. So basically I can have the overhang on this end or this end, depending on where my panels intersect versus the ribs. So I'm going to leave it like this, so my line is closer to the center of the mini rail. Then I'll back out my screws. I just run my screw through the rubber. And I'll do the same thing on this one. Since this is on top of the rib, I have to be very careful not to over tighten my screws. Just a nice little compression on the washer should be enough. Probably a good idea to just grab it and make sure it's nice and tight and it doesn't rock too much. The reason I went with this method is if I ever decide to remove these solar panels, all I have to do is just back these screws out, take the rail off, put the screws back in, and you'll never know the panel was here. Now I need to fasten the rest of them. Now that these mini rails that I painted black are dry, I'll go ahead and install these at the end of every string. So that's it for the mini rails. Next I need to run my ground wire. So I'll bury my ground rods and wire out through here, but for right now I'm just going to run the ground wire up onto the roof and bond all the strings of solar panels together. So here are the ground clamps for these mini rails. They basically just set in there and twist into place, and they can slide back and forth anywhere on the mini rail, but I'm going to put them towards the one end here. I may have to move them depending on where the solar panels hit when I put my panels on. But for right now, I'm going to put them on this end and torque them down. And this ground wire lays in the top there. I'll give myself extra in case I have to move the clamp later. And I'll hand torque these down. Make sure they're good and tight. So I'm going to put one of these at the closest mini rail on every string. So for ground wire management, I'm just using these 1/4-inch coax cable clamps. They come with this small screw in it, but I actually take this out and use the existing roof fastener to fasten these on with. I want to make sure I don't have sharp bends in this ground wire. I want everything to be nice and gradual. I'm going to leave the washer on the metal and set this clamp on top of it. So now I need to bond it to this mini rail. Once again, I'll just put a nice gradual turn in the ground wire and install this ground clamp. Then I'll run my wire up over the peak, fastening it with the ridge cap fasteners, and then bond it to the 2 strings on the other side of the roof. And then I'll use the same process for attaching the ground wire to the sidewall. Each string of panels will have a positive and a negative wire going into the inverter.
One of the wires will get connected at the far end of the string and one at the near end. And since I have equal amounts of positive and negative PV wire, I'm going to have 2 strings with the positive wire going to the far end and 2 strings with the negative wire going to the far end in order to use the same amount of each wire. Since the negative lead on the panel has a female connector, I need to start the negative runs with a male connector. To start a run, I'll just do 1 loop of wire around the farthest mini rail, then zip tie the wire on the side of each mini rail as I head towards the inverter. And I'll leave the remainder of the wire coiled up at the nearest mini rail for now. And for the positive wire, I'll do the opposite and start the runs with a female connector. Next, I laid the end clamps at the end rails and the mid clamps at each rail in between. In order to keep the panels in a straight line, I ran a string where the 2 rows of panels will meet.
So I noticed earlier when installing these ground clamps that this screw wasn't long enough to bottom out in the mini rail. Then I remembered that they sent 4 of these screws and they're a little bit longer than the ones that come on the clamp, so I'm assuming these are to replace these so I can put this anywhere in the mini rail instead of having to fasten it on top of the fastener.
Here is a closer look at the grounding clips. These lay between the panels and the mini rails. They have teeth on each side biting into the aluminum, bonding the panels to each other and to the mini rails. And I'll lay one of these at each mini rail except for the end ones. Now I'm finally ready to install my solar panels. I was planning on wrestling the panels up the ladder, but they are 53 pounds each, which is a bit heavy and awkward to carry up a ladder. Thankfully, my father-in-law came to the rescue with his boom truck. We built a small cage on the pallet the panels came on and lifted them up 9 panels at a time. This made getting them up on the roof a breeze.
I think that'll stay right there. And since I'm running negative wire to the end of this string, I want to make sure that my negative is at the very end to plug into that. This one is the negative, this is the positive, so we need to flip this panel around. Okay, lay it down. And that string is where the top of it's supposed to go. Okay, it needs to go down. Let me tilt it up. So here's the positive going this way. So I'm going to go ahead and detach this and cut these zip ties. And uncoil this so I can attach it to the next panel. Okay, lay it down. Right there. Now, we just want to make sure it's straight with our string line here. And I'll attach the other end clamp. Okay. So got the end clamps fastened. Now I'm going to start this mid clamp to prepare for the next panel. First I'm going to put my grounding clip underneath the panel with the slot facing towards me so I can slide in the mid clamp.
At this time, I do not want to connect the panel wire to the PV wire, as I will do that later after installing my disconnect. I'm only connecting the panels to each other.
Alright, ready for the next panel. Now for the second panel, we'll have to tilt it up. And I'll have to connect the positive from the previous panel to the negative on this panel. And these actually have nice little clips that hold the wire in place. So I'll just add a couple of these wire clips to keep the wire up off of the roof. Okay, lay it down.
It would have been nice if these grounding clips would have been a little bit bigger. I had to finagle them around and be very precise where I placed them in order to catch both panels. And from then on, I just repeated the same process for each panel, building my string. For the second row, I made sure to reverse the panel orientation with the positive wire at the far end to match the positive PV wire I previously ran to the far end. Again, I do not want to connect the panel wire to the PV wire just yet. So that's 2 strings of panels done. Now I just repeat the same process for the other side. If you notice here, I use a 7/8 inch spacer to maintain the same spacing in between the strings as in between the panels. I debated on whether to separate the strings so I could walk between them, but I decided keeping them close together would make for easier snow removal. So that's all for this video. In part 3, I will install the inverter, batteries, and disconnect. Thanks for watching.